Brian, the concept that Jesus was both God and human has led to a great deal of philosophical arguments and discussions, and also has led to a Christology of applying this concept to all sorts of other things in the world, which, at least to begin with, some seem pretty far-fetched. So let's roll it back to the beginning and try to understand what the basis of Christology is all about.
Okay. Christology tries to work out what the nature of Christ is, what sort of thing he is, and it takes as data basically what the New Testament says about that. The New Testament makes claims both that Jesus is human and that Jesus is divine. The philosophical problem is understanding how these two things can fit together. My own preferred way of doing it is to say this: there was a divine person, the second person of the Trinity, God the Son. At a certain point in time, this divine person formed a composite, formed a whole with a particular human body and soul, if there are such things as souls. And at that point, that person was incarnate. That body was his body, that soul was his soul. And so you had one thing made up of three parts: God the Son, a body, and a soul.
Okay, now what happens with these things all blend together, so they're just now one thing that used to be three, and they're kind of like three liquids that have emulsified together, or do they maintain their separate existences?
It's orthodox to say that they maintain their separation.
I don't want orthodox, I want the truth.
Okay, well, I think the orthodoxy is true.
Okay, well, that's a view.
God is an immaterial thing, so he's not going to turn into a body, or he's not going to mix with a body. God is, as I would say, necessarily immaterial. So that's not even a possibility. Neither is God a human soul. He has different capacities. He's not going to. He has many of those capacities by necessity. He's necessarily omnipotent. So he couldn't trim himself down to become a human soul. So God, the soul, and the body have to be distinct. What you do have, though, is that they're more sufficiently closely related that they count as making up one personal being.
And if I were, pardon the aggregation of divinity to myself, but if I were that person, what would I feel like? Would I literally feel the unity that I feel now, or would I have this continuing, very harsh conflict between a human and a divine? I mean, I have my own conflicts, but they're not between human and divine, I can assure you that.
Okay, my own view would be this. There are two answers to that. While Christ was incarnate on earth, he felt pretty much like an ordinary human being. God was putting himself under a kind of a self-imposed temporary limitation. He was operating only with the powers that were there in the body and the soul. He sort of temporarily refused to use anything of his omnipotence. He just did what the body could do, what the soul could do, and so on. After Christ's resurrection and ascension, things are different. Christ then is operating on his God power pack rather than his human power pack.
Now, in Jesus' lifetime, though, he did do some miracles. I mean, I'm not going to be able to do those. Right.
The question is how. The way I look at it, Christ didn't, while on earth, do miracles on his own power. The New Testament narrative tells us that Christ, at his baptism, had the Spirit come down to him, and the Spirit was with him in a special way that it never has been with anybody else. Christ did his miracles by his prayer to God and his communion with the Spirit. And, so to speak, the other persons of the Trinity acted for Christ when he was not drawing on his own personal divine powers.
Okay, let's have that as our background for what core Christology is. What about the applications of that to other things that we see in the world? People have applied Christology to understand many aspects of theology and even into the natural world, Christology of evolution, or the Christology of anthropology, and all sorts of other things. Those kinds of extensions seem to have at least some logical gaps to them.
I think it's a mistake to try to do that. I think Christology is about Christ, and Christ is the great exception. It happened once. God does not incarnate himself in any other way, and God's relationships to nature are, for example, not any kind of incarnation.
So those who would seek to unify, if you will, God with nature in order to solve some so-called problems with science, whether all the way with pantheism or what's called panentheism, which has this unity, you would think is not appropriate.
That's correct. I think God exists necessarily, therefore is immaterial, therefore he's not part of nature, he's not melded into nature, he doesn't flow through nature. He's a separate entity. Nature is material. God is not. They have to be two different things.
And the fact that God is infinite and pervades everything and is immanent in everything, that does not contradict the fact that God is independent of nature?
It depends what you mean by immanence. There are those like the panentheists who take it in a way that would make God no longer a separate thing. I prefer, along with the main Christian tradition, to say what it means to say that God is immanent is this. His power is everywhere present and his knowledge is everywhere present. God knows intimately everything that's going on everywhere at all times. God, so to speak, is hands-on nature everywhere at all times. He's always got everything under control, even though he's letting it perhaps play out in its own way. He's got his hands on it as it plays out. But notice that the metaphor says the hands are one thing, the thing you've got the hands on is something else.